Here are 3 really bad arguments for God.
Argument number 1, the creation argument. This argument is also known as the cosmological argument. And while I could go through the argument in detail, where I go through each premise, I think it's better to explain it in a way that you can use it in a conversation. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, that's fine. All you need to know is that I'm going to break down this argument simply because you don't really need to know the premises unless you're in an actual debate. So the creation argument essentially states that everything that begins to exist must have a reason for its existence.
And what's the justification for that premise? William Lane Craig loves to use this argument, and his explanation of this premise is that we don't see things just pop into existence uncaused. However, something popping into existence implies that there was a time when it didn't exist, followed by a time when it does exist. The universe is the space-time continuum, so by definition, the universe exists whenever time exists. Since this is the case, the universe could not have popped into existence because there was never a time when it wasn't already in existence. This is true even if time doesn't stretch backward infinitely.
So since that's the case, we as people should also have a reason for our existence.
We're made out of chemicals. Chemistry is the reason for our existence.
So this is the way it works. Everything that we see has a cause for its existence. For example, we can look at a building and we can safely assume that there were architects and construction workers that were responsible for making it. On top of that, paintings come from artists, dishes come from chefs, and forests come from seeds, and mountains come from the Earth's tectonic plates moving. So the idea is that all that we see needed to have some kind of cause, and our universe isn't any different. According to science, our universe is expanding, and if it's continuously expanding, then if we were to rewind time, there had to have been a point in which everything started.
If everything includes time itself, then God also had a beginning. To say that something had a beginning is to say that it hasn't existed for infinite time. If it is the case that time itself had a beginning, then everything had a beginning. That would also have to be the case for God. Even God could not have existed for an infinite amount of time if there hasn't been an infinite amount of time. If it is true that everything which begins to exist has a cause, then God, since he began to exist, would also need a cause.
So the question is, how did everything begin? And the answer to this question is still a mystery in science because we obviously can't go back and observe how life actually began.
Given the fact that all life is made out of chemicals, it's a pretty safe bet that life began as some form of chemical activity.
So the creation argument pretty much states that because things exist, things like the universe and its galaxies, stars, and planets, and the Earth with its land, seas, and people, then something or someone had to be responsible for its existence.
If the mere existence of a thing means that it had to have a cause, then God, if he exists, had to have a cause too.
And while people may argue and say, well, maybe the universe was just always here, to that, I'd say that the universe expanding is proof that our universe isn't infinite.
No, it isn't proof, but even if it were, and time had a beginning, that would mean that God had a beginning too. Also, even if time hasn't existed infinitely, it has still always existed in the sense that there was obviously never a time when time didn't exist.
Because it all had to start at a single point in history.
Since the universe is the space-time continuum, the universe by definition would begin when time began. I noticed that you didn't draw the point of the beginning of the universe at the beginning of the timeline. This seems to imply that time preceded the universe's beginning, which by definition it did not.
Because from what we know and observe from the universe, that's the most logical conclusion we can come to. So if the universe and everything in it seems to have needed a cause or reason to exist, then God or some higher power seems to be the only explanation that makes sense.
It doesn't make sense, though. You can't cause something to exist at a time when it already exists, and by definition, there was never a time when the space-time continuum did not exist.
And I know some people will say, you Christians look at the unknown and turn off your minds and credit the unknown to God. At least scientists are out there observing and trying to figure everything out. You know, back when I was in college, I sat in one of my friend's classes, and J.P. Moreland was the professor, and he taught his class something interesting. And he stated that the origin of the universe is outside the realm of science.
If that were the case, then you couldn't cite science as evidence that the universe even had an origin.
And the reason why is because science is based on the scientific method, or in other words, it relies solely on us making observations of the world around us. So due to the fact that time, space, and matter all began at a single point in time, a point in time that no one can go back and observe, science then cannot answer the question of how the universe began. So Morelands, the professor, then asserted that the question of how the universe began should actually be answered in the realm of philosophy, not science.
Again, if science can show that the universe began without directly observing that beginning, why couldn't it show how it began? This is also a common creationist straw man of science. Science does not need to directly observe an event in order to apply the scientific method to studying it. If that were the case, there could be no such thing as forensic science or paleontology. Science can study an event that nobody observed by studying the consequences of that event. That's how we know that there even was a Big Bang.
And I thought that was interesting. For me personally, if someone were to tell me, "You're just turning off your mind and crediting the unknown to God," I'd respond, "I'm not turning off my mind. I just think that a higher power that is greater than time, space, and matter can only be responsible for creating the universe that we observe today."
That's a conclusion that I could only believe if I don't think about it for longer than 2 seconds. What would it even mean for a being to be higher than time, space, or matter? Time and space are the prerequisites of existence itself. To say that something exists is to say that it has location in space-time. To say that something exists without space-time is to say that it exists nowhere and never. In other words, it means the same as saying that it does not exist.
Do you have a better explanation on why everything exists today?
Yeah, it has never not existed, therefore its existence does not need a cause and could not have a cause.
Because if you do, then I'd love to listen and I'm willing to learn. So if you're watching this and you're someone who does not believe in God, I'd challenge you and ask, how do you think we all came to exist?
We came to exist from chemicals, and those chemicals came from fundamental energy that has never not existed and therefore does not need a cause.
Because I think there needs to be some explanation on why we all exist, and I think that God creating everything seems the most likely and logical. And if you're a Christian and you're wondering how to use this argument in a conversation, you can simply ask people, where do you think we all came from? And how do you think the universe began? Because it did not just pop into existence, something or someone needed to have caused it.
I agree that it didn't pop into existence because that implies that there was a time when it wasn't already in existence. There was never a time when the universe did not exist, and that's true even if time has not been infinite.
And if they argue and say, well, how do we know that? Things can just pop into existence, and that might be the case for the universe. To that, I'd probably say that we don't observe things popping in and out of existence freely in our day-to-day lives. So if that's the case, there needs to be a cause for the existence of our universe.
The fact that we never see things begin without cause in no way means that everything needs a cause. I've never seen your mom pop a wheelie on a motorcycle. That doesn't mean it can't happen.
And should people ask, well, who created God then? To help with that question, you can watch our video titled, Who Created God?
How much you want to bet that they make a special pleading argument?
Argument number 2, the design argument. This argument is also known as the teleological argument. And in the same way that I skipped explaining the premises for the creation argument, I'll also skip that here, because the goal for this video isn't to prepare debaters, but to help Christians understand these arguments so that they can better be used in a conversation. So this argument pretty much states that complex and intelligent design must come from an intelligent mind or designer.
Yeah, but you need an argument to establish that the complexity we see in nature is, in fact, design. Complexity itself does not prove design, and even complexity with very specific consequences does not prove design. The idea that it does is a complete non sequitur.
So let's look at the complexity of people. And I cover this in our Is There Really a God video. And in it, I talk about how within a single person, they have a cardiovascular system, an endocrine system, a digestive, respiratory, excretory, lymphatic, nervous, muscular, and skeletal system.
So what? Why do you assume that complexity can't exist without being deliberately designed? I think this idea is the consequence of the common creationist assumption that the default state of reality is chaos, and that order, especially complex order, can only exist if it is deliberately imposed by a conscious mind. There is no reason to assume this whatsoever.
And on top of that, according to the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, the DNA from one of our cells is 6 feet long. So if we were to uncoil all of the DNA from all of our cells, it would amount to being 67 billion miles long. And to give you a better idea of that length, we could take 150,000 round trips to the moon with that much DNA, and that's just the DNA of one person.
Wow, I guess a god must have designed it for some reason. Without a god, how could long things possibly exist?
So the design argument would suggest that a person is too complex, and evolution could not have been the reason why people exist, regardless of how many billions of years occur.
It's not the entire reason why people exist. People also exist because of chemistry. Why, though, would evolution and chemistry not be able to produce a human?
For example, it would be nonsense to think that a laptop in a forest got there by evolution.
Not if laptops reproduced and mutated. If they did, then it would be entirely reasonable to infer that they got there by evolution.
Because even if all the necessary parts of a laptop were in an area, and that area was untouched, and nature just had its way for billions of years, a working laptop would not be the result.
It would be if the parts self-replicated and mutated.
Yet many people who believe in evolution use this line of reasoning for people, and they'll suggest that the building blocks for people were in an area, and over time, an organism formed, and from that, it kept evolving until we got to people.
And why is that not a perfectly reasonable inference?
And I do want to add that I do find a lot of credibility in evolution within a species.
Given that we've directly observed speciation, why don't you believe that one species can evolve into another?
Like Darwin's finches, for example. Finches do evolve over time, but they don't become anything other than birds.
Well, first of all, birds are not a species. Secondly, this assertion actually doesn't contradict how evolutionary biology classifies organisms. It's true that birds, no matter how much they evolve, will always be birds because biologists categorize organisms by their ancestry. Not only will any organism that descends from birds always be a bird, birds, since they descended from dinosaurs, are technically still dinosaurs. Also, dinosaurs and even humans, since we all evolved from fish, are cladistically still technically fish.
And we do have wolves that mate with lesser violent canines. And evolution can create a bunch of different types of dogs. However, they stay dogs.
Yeah, but dogs are wolves. This is the case not just because they descended from wolves, but also because they haven't even yet speciated from wolves. Any two organisms that can mate and produce fertile offspring are, by definition, the same species. Dogs are not a different species from wolves. They are a subspecies.
It's evolution that turns species into other species, like fishes turning into birds and birds turning into dogs.
No evolutionary biologist has ever claimed that birds turned into dogs. Also, as I previously explained, birds are technically still fish.
That I would disagree with. And the reason why is because in our fossil record, I don't recall seeing much of any transitional species that were in the middle of evolving.
Literally every species is in the middle of evolving. A lot of creationists seem to think that the way evolution works is that it has stages. They think that there's a species that is not evolving, then it goes through a period of evolving until it becomes another species, at which point it stops evolving until it's time to evolve again. That's not how it works. Every generation has evolved to some minute extent from the previous generation. This is corroborated by the fact that we have been able to predict what features a particular fossil will have long before it is ever found. For example, the evolution of Pakicetus into cetaceans. Pakicetus had nostrils on the end of its snout, and cetaceans have blowholes on the tops of their heads. So there should be fossils of organisms that have nostrils at various points in between, right? Well, that's exactly what we find, and we find them in the exact fossil layers we expect to find them.
So going back to the argument of design, complex and intelligent design requires a complex designer.
But how do you figure that human biology is intelligent design in the first place?
So when you look at the complexity of people and all that makes up a single person, this kind of complexity had to have come from some higher power.
Why? Why would complexity need to come from a higher power? This seems like an entirely baseless assertion.
So if you're someone that doesn't believe in God and you think that evolution makes more sense and that people did evolve, I would challenge you to think of a time when life can come from non-life.
When the first nucleotide chain started to self-replicate.
Or in other words, if evolution did start everything and the world started with a bunch of non-living things that people ultimately evolved from.
No, that's a straw man. The theory of evolution does not claim that evolution started everything. Chemistry started life and evolution took it from there.
Can you think of another time when life was able to emerge from something that wasn't alive?
Can you ever think of a time when life came from something that was not made of chemicals?
Because if that's not the case, then where did life begin? You could say you just don't know, but I think that the most logical explanation is life coming from some originator of life.
I agree, it came from chemicals, the stuff that all life is made out of.
And I would call this originator of life God.
You call chemicals God?
And if you're a Christian and you're wondering how you can use this argument in a conversation, I would encourage you to ask a lot of questions on what someone believes regarding the complexity of life. And I'd say something along the lines of, People are incredibly complex. Where do you think we came from, and how do you think life started? In my personal podcast, Practical Christianity, I interviewed my friend who works as a chemist, and I asked him what his view on evolution was. And he told me that as a chemist, he works hard to make sure that the chemicals he creates all have the correct measurements. So if his chemicals and complex compounds that he makes all require intelligence, he thinks that since the world and people have so much more complexity than the chemicals he makes, it only makes sense that a mind of greater intelligence is responsible for creating it.
Well, of course, all of the chemicals he creates require an intelligence, because if they didn't, he could just collect them from nature instead of making them in a lab. It doesn't follow from this that all chemicals require an intelligence. That's a total non sequitur.
And argument number 3, the moral argument. This argument pretty much states that because people have universal laws that they all abide by,
They do? Name one single moral law that everyone abides by.
it's evidence of God, because he had to give people these laws.
If God didn't need to be given the laws, why would people?
To explain it more, murdering babies, purposefully polluting water reservoirs, and other crimes like rape are wrong. And while that seems obvious that they're wrong, the question is, why do we think they're wrong?
Well, clearly not everyone does think they're wrong, especially the one about polluting the water supply. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.